Helena de Bres, Helena de Bres. It's the S is maybe not something I should pronounce, but I'm doing it anyway because I'm so happy to have you
Do
on the
you
podcast.
really out of mind?
I sometimes I rush into your name. I had this conversation with I guess last week where it's like I kind of just steamroll it. I'm like I'm not sure what's gonna come out this time. And I just say any old thing. So I'm sorry about
No, it's good. Sometimes people try to be pretentious and not pronounce the S like it's French. That's wrong. Pronounce
that's
the S.
wrong.
Yeah.
I know, yeah, I figured I'd take the more salt of the earth approach because you would prefer that, and it's the more correct approach anyway. Um, okay, beautiful. Well, Helena, I'm so thrilled to have you here. We're talking about a lot of we're talking about one book of yours primarily, but we're going to talk about all three to some extent. I'm holding up two, but I've also read the third. To be clear, audience. Um, you are, in addition to being a great friend and an incredible writer, you are a professor of philosophy at Wellesley College, who has written variously on topics of analytic philosophy, memoir, the essay as a form, in some capacity, like analytic, social psychology. Your three books are How to Be Multiple. This is our topic of interest today. Artful Truths. This is your first book. And your third book, which I think is a heroic piece of nonfiction, Philosophy in the First Person, which instructs philosophers in a much needed for them and for everyone generally, but really for philosophers, practice of self-reflection and creative writing. Helena, I'm sorry, I had your bio pulled up, and then I realized that I read this from the printout and not from the desktop because that would be foolish of me. So I'm going to simply say what I do know about you, which is that you are I think you are currently chairing, right? You're currently
No,
doing a
I've
lot of
actually
service at
been
Wellesley.
released from that.
You've
Yes,
been released.
I hope to never be the chair again. So I'm
Oh,
better suited to
hallelujah.
the job as doing it and enjoying it. So yes, I'm just
Good.
a professor of philosophy at Wellesley. That's my day job.
You are a full professor of philosophy at Wellesley. You've been released from so many committees immediately. She's a free woman, folks. Her service has dramatically decreased, and you are, in addition to having written for just a number of outlets I really adore, like Psyche, like The Point. You're also I hear a really amazing lip syncer. And this is something you're known for internationally.
Yeah,
Actually, do
that's
you want
right.
to talk a bit about that?
I do mainly perform in New Zealand. I have yet to perform up north, but perhaps I will
Sure.
shift to that sometime this year. Yes, our family has an annual lip sync competition, and the whole family partakes, the octogenarians and the youngsters, and my sister and I in the middle there. And yeah, my main shtick is sort of 80s rock gods. I just did Prince last week. I think that
Uh,
was
oh, what a treat. Folks, if you can ever get down to New Zealand,
to my childhood
um,
home living room.
specifically to the living room, the childhood home that Lena grew up in, it's just such a treat to see her and her family perform at the Lips and Chips. Hope I'm getting that right.
Sure.
Um, lip syncing contest.
Mhm.
You see, this is I'm gonna be candid as if I haven't been already. I'm gonna be candid, Helena, and say that if I had been a philosophy undergraduate student and I had stumbled upon this eccentric, interesting, whatever Substack video podcast thing and learned that my professor was a lip syncing champ, I would have been like, I'm in the right place. This is the right major. The humanities are alive and well, and I think many more people will major in this.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about integrating it into the recruitment effort, but it's a great idea. Who wouldn't?
I'm still always there,
Yeah.
right there. Just kidding. But seriously, if I was a student, I'd be like, what a cool thing to learn about my
I feel
prof.
like I don't expect philosophy professors to be cool in any way. So it's a very, it's a low bar. But yeah, I think lip sync gets you a little higher than the
I
other thing.
think yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are putting you far over the edge. One of them being how beautifully you write. Um, I'm so excited to talk about How to Be Multiple today. I know you're going to read a selection from it for us. I'll let you preface this book because only you can talk about the experience of being a twin. The two of us here, I do not have that expertise. So please tell us
Yeah.
more, read from it. I'm very excited.
Yeah, so this is a book that started during the pandemic. I just finished the first book. I wanted to write something else, and I'd written an essay about twins, but I hadn't written at length about them. And I thought this would be an ideal subject for the genre that I'm particularly interested in, which is a mix of personal narrative and philosophical reflection. I just love doing that kind of thing. And this subject is just really made for that. Obviously, I'm an identical twin, so it's a deeply personal subject for me. But also, I just think twinhood is so rich philosophically. There are so many questions, metaphysical ones, ethical ones, questions about love, what it is to be a human, that just arise immediately as soon as you think about twins. So it felt like this very rich kind of terrain for exploration, and also just sounded like a fun project. So started writing it that year, and then I ended up going down to New Zealand to live right next door to my twin for a year. So it was kind of fabulous to spend that year with her while I was working on it, and she ended up illustrating the book. So it was a super cute little project, but also it was really enlightening for me. I wrote it because I wanted to talk to other twins and non-twins about twinhood, but also just personally, it was super, super valuable to spend this time really thinking about this relationship that's so important to me. So yes, so the book goes through a bunch of questions about twinhood that have philosophical dimensions. So I think I'm going to start by reading just a short section from the chapter that's called How Many of You Are There? Each of the chapters has a question that twins get asked. We don't directly get asked this one, but we get asked other things that I think point to this question. So just read a short section. Julia and I were working at a library a couple of years ago on projects with tight deadlines when I heard myself say distractedly, I'm going to the restroom. Do you want me to go for you too? Julia's concentration glazed eyes lifted from her laptop, quivered briefly, then settled into an expression of derision. Oh, wow, I said, blinking. What the? I think I will empty my own bladder, thank you, Julia suggested. Fine, I replied, collecting myself. You do you. As I headed to the toilet, I could hear Julia sniggering behind me. I was amused too, but also unsettled. We'd spent practically all our time together over the past month during my annual visit to New Zealand, and this was a vivid sign that I'd lost significant grip on where I ended and she began. I try to ward off a creeping sense of interpersonal merger whenever I spend more than 5 consecutive days with Julia, but clearly the ramparts had collapsed once again, and my resulting assumption that we somehow shared a urinary system suggested my departure would be wrenching. I was also annoyed at myself for a more intellectual reason. Some rogue part of me had apparently adopted a view about the metaphysics of twinhood that I've spent much of my life resisting. Singletons have a habit of implying that twins aren't fully distinct people, but rather somehow a single person spread over two bodies. To cite a random set of examples, Antonio asks of Sebastian and Viola in Twelfth Night, how have you made division of yourself? An apple cleft in two is not more twin than these two creatures. The Nuer people of South Sudan don't hold a ceremony when one twin dies because they believe the surviving twin will continue the life of its sibling. The twin protagonists of Michel Tournier's novel Gemini are collectively referred to by a single name, Jean Paul. And the chief surgeon of the Hôpital Bichat in Paris explicitly announced in 1926, as a matter of medical fact, that single-egg twins are two copies of the same person, not genuinely individual human beings. If asked directly, most people would deny that they consider twins a metaphysical unit, but their behavior often suggests they're inclined in that direction. Especially as children, we twins are given a single present to share, are referred to as the twins, instead of by our individual names, and are treated as interchangeable in friend groups or by teachers. Keeping track of who we are doesn't seem super important because we're assumed to sub in for each other in most social roles. And people get an evident satisfaction out of grouping us together. When I post photos of me with Julia on my trips back home, they blow up with likes in seconds. Our friends are happy we're having fun, but it's also as if our geographical reunion has mended a puzzling tear in the fabric of the universe, and everyone feels better now. You might think that only a singleton would be tempted by the idea that twins are a single or duplicated person or a split self, but some twins seem drawn to it too. One developmental study describes a pair of twins who, between the ages of 2 and 4, routinely used a single name, singular verbs, and the pronoun me when referring to themselves collectively. After observing them chatting at 36 months, the researcher recorded in his notes, they talked as if they considered themselves one. Julia and I have distinct personalities. We live independent lives in different countries. I don't have access to her calendar, let alone her thoughts. And when someone steps on her foot, I don't feel it. If there's any basis for thinking we're one person, I've always assumed, it must be some incoherent or mystical conception of personhood that it'd be not only unprofitable, but uncharitable to examine. That's been my public take on the matter. And then I find myself offering to pee on behalf of my twin. Whatever my level of distraction, I'm pretty sure there's no one on the planet other than Julia whose bladder I would offer to empty, setting aside myself. So that's an intro to that question, which then goes into this this question of what the boundaries are between twins and whether it makes sense to see them as in some way a single person.
I mean, such a kind of fabulous entree to this, uh, you know, exploration, intervention, book links, essays, that that we're talking about here today. And I think I also just want to zoom out for a second and talk about how much I love, like, I think the thing I first fell in love with about your writing is how funny it is. And I love that you are a funny writer. And I love that you are a philosopher who's funny. Like, I'm not sitting down to Arendt or Adorno for chuckle. I'm not, sometimes I'm laughing at Nietzsche, but wasn't intending it. And so we've all been there. We know how that goes. Like, I think that and we'll probably talk a bit more about this when we talk about philosophy in the first person, but the fact that you're not only game to situate yourself, like, in your personal experience within the field of inquiry, which, as you know, probably most people listening to this know, is very, very in keeping with the feminist and queer traditions of like literary criticism and philosophical inquiry more broadly. You're game to do that, right? But you do it so artfully, right? There's a lot of great postmodern criticism that's about lived experience and the embodiment. So little of it is funny, and so little of it takes the kind of like winking, sardonic, I think very smart approach to this very serious project that your writing does. So I do want to commend you for
Oh,
that.
that's so nice to hear from you, given that you're absolutely hilarious. We're just throwing back compliments now, but yeah, I feel like it's part, I want to, at this stage in my career, I want to write authentically. We'll talk about this more later. I want to do philosophy if I'm going to do it with my whole self. And I do tend to approach the world in a comic way. And so it feels like I'm not really fully present if I'm not allowing myself to be funny. So it's not something you can do very easily in the beginning of the career because there are all these pressures that are forcing you to be very, very serious. But I think you get to a certain point where you're able to allow yourself to be more fully yourself in the classroom and on the page. And if we can do that, I think we should. It seems like a wasted opportunity not to.
Oh, absolutely. Like, why not, especially once someone has tenure, why not try out some new material? Why not sharpen that Titan five? If you bomb, you can just give everyone C's. Oh, sorry. Here I go. I'm going kind of on a tangent here, but yeah, I mean, I completely agree, right? There's so much. I think that again, something else we'll get into down the line, but the direction, um, like, collegiate philosophy and higher education have kind of both gone in. um, is just a very like self-serious direction, emphasis on like analytic philosophy and axioms, and like we are investigating and we must be right. We can only be right about a very small set of things. And so, there's a very, I think that like the practice of philosophy is very heavily bounded, and your work really just kind of frees up some creative space and some, just like cognitive space, I think. And I'm sure your students appreciate it. In fact, I know they do. But let's zooming back in here. Let's zoom back in here on how to be multiple. I love the selection you read so much, Lena, because it really gets at a problem, a problem. I'm referring to everything in like philosophy terms, but like, yeah, a question, a really interesting question, about like the experience of twinhood that I think doesn't get discussed terribly often, at least accurately. There's so much ado made about singletons being unable to tell identical twins or same egg twins. Those of you who've read Helena's book will maybe refer to twins as identical twins as same egg twins now. Um, you know, we can't tell them apart, right? It's like, oh, it's the Parent Trap, and Lindsay Lohan plays both characters, like that kind of the vagary, right, of the twins' respective identities is something that I think gets used a lot in fiction. It shows up in real life, right? But I was actually just talking with my wife about this. We were both like, we've never had this issue. Like, she has known many twins. I have known only a few, but neither of us has been like, oh, are you Damon or Devin? Like, that's never really
The
been a
definite.
struggle we've had. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's like when you talk about this in the book too, like when you're really with both you and Julia, right? It's unmistakable, right? If you know both twins, it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of silly to think that you'd be the same person. Um, but what's really interesting to me is the concept that passage you read touches on, which is the selfhood or qualia, like the kind of conscious experience spread across two bodies, the potential for that. Something we also see come up with, kind of like telepathic twins, so on and so forth in fiction, and there's some reportage on that in nonfiction as well. But this is like popularly debunked until stuff like that happens, right? Until you have that moment you described where you're like, "Whoa, how did I just offer to pee for both of us?" You also talk about there's some wonderful moments in this book, that kind of testify to this experience. Julia screaming over the birthday cake for both of you, like working the joy out of your collective system when you guys are young. Um, the I think this is kind of more the binarizing part of things, but you are the writer and she's the illustrator, but the fact that she is not the writer makes your being the writer in the pair possible
Right.
somehow. Like you get so like there's also that kind of like yeah, the opposition that I think like the two halves of the whole um yeah, that I guess that paradigm kind of speaks to. I hesitate to use the word paradigm, but we can kind of investigate that further. So, Helena, I'm really excited for you to talk about this phenomenon as a stabilizing and destabilizing force and what kind of impact it's had on your writing and thinking.
Yeah, so yeah, my thoughts and feelings about this question evolved while I was writing the book, because I think growing up it can be quite irritating when you're a twin and you have people constantly treating you as if you were, the same person. It feels diminishing in certain ways. You feel irritated by it. It feels like people could just try harder, and it's the sense that you're somehow less than a person if you're not two separate people. So it feels like some kind of insult or something that yeah, you wouldn't want to be true of yourself. So I feel like when I was for most of my life, I fought against that idea. So I went into this book project thinking, okay, we're going to do this essay on how no, twins are totally distinct people, and here are all the reasons why. But I'm sitting in the library starting to write that chapter, and then I have this experience that I describe, right, where I suddenly seem to somehow think not that Julia and I actually share the same body, and I know intellectually that is obviously not true, right? But I felt it in a way that's kind of deep enough for me to say that and for me to really feel quite shocked by it. So I changed the focus of the chapter. I thought even if you end up wanting to say that twins are, distinct individuals for a bunch of obvious reasons, it's still interesting to think about how they might function in certain ways as the same person, right? So the question became like, how can we make sense of these feelings that twins definitely have about their own twinship, even if like me, they try and suppress them, right? And what is it that people are picking up, when singletons make these claims, and in a kind of non-hostile way? Like there is a phenomenon there, right? So I decided to be more sensitive to and more open to that possibility, and just kind of opened up the whole issue for me in helpful ways. And I think that, the book is about twins, but it's also about the way that twins can help us think about other relationships. And so I think once you start thinking about the ways that twins can function as a single self, you can also see similar things, maybe in not as vivid a way or as obvious a way, in relationships between super close friends or between romantic partners or parents and babies, right? We use these metaphors a lot of the time that suggest that we share selves with those that we're super close to. But I think sometimes they're not just metaphors, they're actually getting at a certain kind of set of metaphysical or cognitive unions that are really important to just the process of being in any kind of relationship with a human. So yeah, in the end, I think that I'm more open to the idea of the boundaries of the self being porous than I was at the beginning of the project. Um, and yeah, some people go in open to that idea. I was like a hard-headed, analytic philosopher who was like, a Westerner who was super committed to the liberal conception of the self. And I just feel less committed to it now as a result of thinking about these questions.
You've kind of arrived at like an almost a Zen place here, like the dissolution of the individual ego, or like a pan-psychic place
Ego
to go
death.
maybe in an Aldous Huxley direction. But yeah, I mean, I love what I love too, about what you said, Helena, is that, and this is so common of so much of the work of yours I've read, but it's like you are constantly reevaluating your thinking, which
Yeah,
is it really contravenes everything we've learned in these, kind of more analytic philosophical settings. But like you are willing to encounter a counterexample, and it's so refreshing to see you grapple with it or readjust your thinking, as opposed to make the entire project about addressing a single counterexample. It's
right.
just really nice.
Yeah, it was liberating writing about twins because I thought a lot of people in the field are going to think this is a complete waste of time already. You're already writing about something super weird. The philosophy of twins is not a thing. It's not a established subfield of philosophy. They've already
Mm,
sort of thrown myself off the deep end by writing a book like this and writing it in this way with a lot of personal narrative in it, and using humor and so on. So it's like I've already made that, I've already kind of stepped outside the bounds of what is standard philosophy. And I think that allowed me to open myself up to positions in philosophy that I might have been kind of, afraid to admit to. So
mm.
it felt like the genre and the subject matter allowed me to move out into that territory in ways that I wouldn't if I'd been writing about something more standard and core in the field. Um,
Yeah. I mean, and using yourself as a test subject, right? Like once again, I think it's that really pleasant union of the like feminist or queer theoretical kind of critique, and like the yeah, the Enlightenment positivist analytic philosopher in you, right? But it's a kind of a cool to have some hope. Yeah,
those things are in there.
I think that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't.
I'll
I think
just
those things are in there, and they don't. Neither of them really is ever going to go. I think so. It does mean there's this internal dialectic that's always available for treatment on the page because it's not like I'm firmly aligned with either camp. So it's useful, I guess. Yeah.
totally. I mean, would you say they're both primitive? Welcome to the jokes. Only Helena and I and the philosophy professors who follow me on here are gonna laugh at. Sorry, everybody. Um, yeah, in the vein, I think of a dissolution to the liberal concept of the self. I'm really excited to talk about moral agency vis-a-vis twins. There's just so like you're right, right? I'm whatever people want to say about this not being a cogent topic in philosophy or well-bounded or whatever, you can't present the paper on it. It is nevertheless a topic that is immensely fruitful and yields so many like really valuable questions that actually relate to like metaphysics and like theories of selfhood and like consciousness and a lot of topics that are in fact quite well bounded and heavily published about. And of course, we have the topic of moral agency and what we owe each other, ethics, broadly speaking. Of the many quotes in How to Be Multiple that really, really got me excited, this one got me especially fired up. We can't hold people responsible for their past actions, demand they keep their promises, claim our entitlements from them, fulfill our duties toward them, or compensate them for their sacrifices if we're not sure who they are. And you're kind of running this basically in response to how twins challenge Singleton's concepts of the self, right? And we're getting as Western as we possibly can here. Like we're talking about one body, one mind, totally material, like, everything is just physical and material, and the thing that we think of when we're saying the mind is usually like this kind of self-critical and eternal narration and sets of worries about doing the laundry and whether or not you're going to get your job done. That is the self, right? And if I, as a singleton, am say mixing you and Julia, right, or hearing this experience where you offered to go to the bathroom for your twin, and I'm like, oh my God, I actually had a similar experience with X. That challenges my notion of selfhood, right? I think in the same way too that something like amnesia, might challenge we're getting to kind of Oliver Sacks territory here, right? But like you talk about a lot of you know, neurological delusions, right? They're these really rare disorders where a patient develops paranoia or forgetfulness or assumes that everyone they know is impersonating each other. Um, I thought too of gender transition, right, where you have folks who get very hardline about this and are like, "I was always a boy. I was always a boy. There was never any girl me whatsoever. That's my dead name. Don't call me that." And I think you these are cases that call to mind the same set of questions for me as the case you propose here, or rather observe. So I'm really excited to talk more with you about like the consistency of the self and twins challenge to that and kind of what you learned while writing and living.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so this is connected to this aspect of twinhood uh that both twins and singletons can can be startled by. So pet twins are often seen as creepy or sort of sinister or slippery in some way. So they're seen as stepping outside like moral norms or social norms. So that they're just like tricky characters. And that idea is spelled out in these various narratives and sort of tropes about twins changing places or impersonating each other in certain ways. You can't keep track of them. Which one are they? It creates this kind of anxiety. But yeah, as I say in the book, I think that anxiety is a reflection of a broader anxiety we can have about whether we can really treat the people that we run into as consistent, stable individuals, right? You don't really know whether even people you know super well might change radically overnight. That's unsettling. And also we might turn it in on ourselves and worry about whether we are consistent over time too. Why do we care about that so much? One reason is the moral one that you started with, right? That it seems like if we can't treat each other as stable and unified over time, it's going to be hard to like press obligations and responsibilities on each other, fulfill our own, and also demand that others fulfill theirs, toward us. So there's a sort of set of, it's obviously also just existentially destabilizing to think of yourself or people you know as changing radically, in a second. But there's also this ethical worry. Um, So yeah, so I think twins are just one kind of vehicle for expressing that anxiety and that question about what it is that holds us together over time as a, a single individual. I'm not one of these people who thinks, there's all this talk about the postmodern fluid self as having, no continuity at all. There's no kind of core to the individual. I am kind of old school, I think, in that I maybe it's just because personally at the sort of phenomenological level. I do feel kind of consistent. I mean, there are features in me that have changed a lot for sure over my, 47 years. But I'm one of these people who feels internally like I'm the same person I was back in like in the 1980s, even if I was obsessed with My Little Ponies or whatever, and I'm not or not as obsessed with them anymore. So I have this kind of internal sense that I am quite unified. So, but there are plenty of people who really don't, who really see themselves as having gone through multiple selves across the course of like biological existence. So I think there's variation on how troubled we might be by that phenomenon. But I certainly do think that, we trick ourselves a lot into thinking that we have more unity and stability than we do. Even if it is the case that there are certain things that are constant in ourself, in our friend. There are other things that are a lot more fluid. And I think we like to tell ourselves that we're a lot more stable than we are. So yeah, so I there's this question about what you should say about the self, if it really does change significantly over time. Like where is it located? Is it a real thing at all? And there's big, long philosophical discussions over that about that question. I'm maybe it's because I'm a memoirist, but there's a particular view about that I like, which is the narrative conception of the self, which says that what it is that constitutes us as a person over time is the fact that we see our present experience in the context of an ongoing life narrative. So we have certain kinds of materials and we construct a self out of them in a narrative way. So it's partly a matter of the given. There are certain kind of like biological and social facts about who we are, but we also have this kind of agency in choosing which parts of the given we see as being central to who we are. So there's a certain kind of continuity because we create that continuity by telling a story about ourselves. Not everyone likes that answer, but I kind of like it because it allows for the fact that the self is constructed in certain ways and in that sense, not fully objectively real, you might say. But also, it acknowledges that there are some foundational elements in there too that we're playing with when we do that.
It's actually, I mean, surprise, surprise, the construction I love as well. I think like the narrative or biographical self really effectively walks the line between what I see as, yeah, that the postmodern endlessly fluid self feels to me kind of like a almost like a nihilistic gateway towards and like unbounded skepticism. Like when you kind of when you step in there, then you have kind of a an anarchy that ensues that I think is very different from this understanding the self as uh, like a construct that involves the one's ego. I guess I'm getting psychoanalytic, but I'm also being Buddhist about it. I'm kind of using ego in the Buddhist sense, like one's ego, that kind of internal narration, but also these dimensions of selfhood that can be, I think, as you alluded to, revealed over a course of a life, right? Or grown into, stepped into, understood about oneself. And yeah, something about that kind of like constant, the postmodern flux, it really opens the gates for like kind of a lack of accountability. And
I
we
think
do need, right? Like we have a sort of social agreement. We need unified, well, some kind of unified understanding of self. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that gets taken too far, maybe for dramatic effect. I don't know.
Yeah.
And another thing that I like about the narrative conception is that it's usually spelled out socially too. So the idea is that we create these narratives not just, by ourselves, but using resources that we have from our relationships and cultural traditions. So it gets at this really important aspect of the book about twins, this theme that runs right the way through, which is that, who we are is a deeply social matter, right? Who we are is affected in a fundamental way by the close relationships that we have. Twins are a really good example of that because they just grow up, next to each other in step. they have this very often, very close, intimate connection. But it applies to, all humans. You can't really become a self unless you are reflected in, the reactions and relationships that you have with other people. And the narrative conception allows for that and kind of it fits in very nicely with it. So that's part of its appeal for me.
I agree. I mean, I think the word I would actually use for the kind of like postmodern eternal flux conception is like antisocial. And so I really appreciate the pro-social formulation of the narrative selfhood, right? Selfhood is something that like sort of happens in community, right? It can't happen without it. I love too when you got into more discussion about like twins and binaries, the slippery character piece. Um, yeah, we see twins in fiction, and one has to be good, one has to be evil, like that whole kind of um interesting, almost mythological conception of twins. I was so fascinated by the way you charted your own like unfolding sense of self in distinction to with Julia's like there's so many contrasts, right? But there are so many things she needed to be so you could be what you are, things you need to be so she can be what she is. It was really interesting for me because you describe yourself in the book and your other writings as the more saturnine, right? Like you're kind of um following after the boisterous gregarious Julia, and she's the one who's taking risks, and you're like, oh, I'll be here to help you. If you fall flat on your face, I'll pick up the pieces, like that kind of thing. But it struck me as sort of delightful because no, I know only you, right? And we've had this friendship of texting and writing to each other, and you actually in those messages were quite boisterous, right? And you described like a big
Right.
soiree and stuff, and so I was like, oh, this is really it's interesting because like this is a relationship, of course, that Lena has, but have had no insight into beyond your writings about it. But it was cool to see these dimensions of your life, right? And then also see how I had like perceived perceived you, as someone who's entirely outside of your sphere in that way.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I think a lot of twins feel this way. Like all the ones that I've spoken to after the book came out, like, yes, I felt those binaries too. I was the introvert and she was the extrovert. They were the sporty one and I was the nerd. There's all these like very, very common dimensions along which twins are, placed one, they're one at each end of the spectrum. Um, and yeah, so it's a very, very common phenomenon. And some people can feel that, that there's something necessarily distorting about that because obviously humans are super complicated. And as you're pointing out, I like to think of myself as the introvert, but I'm so much more extroverted than many introverts that I know. So this whole habit of contrasting myself with Julia, putting us in these two very starkly defined camps, you can see it as distorting and problematic, right? But I actually, I can see that. That's true. It can be. But I feel, maybe after having written the book, I also feel like there's something useful, valuable, and sometimes even beautiful about that habit. It's almost like you're using another person to kind of narrow in on who you are, or maybe who you want to be, the self that you want to construct for yourself. So you have this other figure that allows you to kind of triangulate in that way. And it's just another example of how it is that other people can assist us in our identity and self-construction. I think there's something kind of lovely about that when you get on well with the person and it's a healthy relationship. As long as you don't get fully trapped, in the conception you start with, it can be a way of exploring different options. Over time, you might realize, okay, I've got these introverted features, but I also, I'm like the party animal in other contexts, whatever. So yeah, I think it's obviously a really a not particularly refined and subtle distinction early on, but it's something you can work with later, and I think take in a more healthy and direction that helps your flourishing rather than constrains it.
I mean, when you put it that way, it almost feels like a twin is a willing mirror because a
Yeah.
twin is so game, right, to reflect you. This is so much a part of your like, like close preoccupation with each other growing up because you described you and Julia also being a part of this. Like, okay, we're reading Sweet Valley High, right? Like which one of us is, which twin? Yeah,
Yeah.
and so you're also engaging in it, and then there is a way in which that is, I think, very constructive, right? Very edifying or gratifying.
And there can be something kind of playful about it too.
Yeah,
So yeah. Yeah, it's sort of like trying on different roles. It's sort of in some ways a little bit of a joke, and you know that people are expecting you to fall into these distinct camps. So there's this kind of performative element to it, with respect to singletons, right? So sometimes you use that contrast because it's kind of helpful to you in certain ways, and so you're a team kind of making, yeah, sort of instrumentalizing what might be seen as a tool to kind of simplify you and using it for your own purposes. So it can be kind of fun to do it as well.
yeah. Well, what a lovely case study and case studies contain this book. Highly recommend How to Be Multiple, everyone watching. We're going to delve a bit deeper into your catalog, your oeuvre, with your essay series in the point, which I just loved. It's how I found you. Um, Helena wrote an essay series for the magazine The Point, which you're almost certainly familiar with it if you're watching this. Um, about her disenchantment with analytic philosophy. And so you went to MIT for grad school, which is very, very heavy in the kind of more like math and symbolic logic and philosophy of language side of things. And as of course, as we were kind of talking about this earlier, this is what a lot of people come to American universities to study when they're like, okay, I'm studying philosophy. So it's very Western kind of Bertrand Russell, Jane Austen side of the discipline. You'll take ancient philosophy, right? Like you'll read the Republic, you'll read Aristotle, but then you're really kind of slotted into the analytic side of things. And so you wrote in your signature hilarious style about your feeling of kind of like getting burned out on this style of philosophy. Um, in particular, the seeking of the truth, uh, when the truth is, as you put it in one of my favorite essays from this series, the uppermost half inch of the northwest portion of the liver, right? And then here, like you're kind of making fun of the claim that, like, okay, I could make a positivist claim. I can make it. I figured out the axiom. I figured out the true thing. It's true. It's like God level true, but it's only true about the uppermost half inch of the northwest portion of the liver. These very kind of tiny, heavily bounded claims. And you as you're kind of like teaching your undergrads, right? And doing the thing one does in the philosophy department, you're starting to think that philosophy may have lost touch with just like inquiry more broadly, and the like embracing uncertainty, I think, that comes with it. We're not trying to ask questions so much as we're trying to like find definitive answers, and the big questions start to contract. And so your series, like it began, I think, with an essay called What is your philosophy of life? Which I was like, well, I'm clicking on this immediately. Um, I'm really excited to hear more from you about kind of what inspired that and where you're at with philosophy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I'm not against truth. I'm not an anti-truther. I do think that truth is one of the things that philosophy should pursue, right? It's part of the picture. I think my main kind of
It's
beef
in
with
there.
the analytic philosophy is the way that it gets pursued, and also the sense that pursuing the truth is the only thing that philosophy can do or should do. So yeah, it gets pursued in analytic philosophy in this very specific way, which involves taking these really big human questions and trying to break them up into smaller ones and smaller ones and smaller ones till they're tractable, right? And then you write a journal article in a very conventional format and style. to, advocate for one particular very narrow thesis, right, and defend it to the hilt. So you start with this really big question that has obvious human significance, and at the end of it, you've come to this much smaller question, which has significance in the sense because it allows you to get a paper published and keep your job, and so it's a shrinking of the aims of philosophy via the method that I think is really problematic. I see why people do it. I did it myself. I may continue to do it. I'm not sure. I'm sort of over the academic article at this point, but there are reasons to do it. But I do regret the shrinkage that it's created methodologically, and also I think just in general, philosophy wasn't always just about pursuing the truth. I think it's also about offering illumination, right, of maybe a truth already, helping you to see it more clearly. It's also about putting yourself into a certain state of mind where you're receptive to certain experiences. It's about, trying to loosen your grip on certain commitments you might have. So it's not always about finding some brand new thesis that you can defend. It's a bunch of other things too. So I did the analytic philosophy thing for a long time. That's how I got my current job, and I still teach it a lot. But I just increasingly had this sense of malaise and, boredom basically with the task that I'd been assigned. And so that essay series was really me coming out about those things and trying to think about how it might be possible to write in a new way about new things that allowed us to see a clearer connection between what we're doing academically and what motivated us to get going on this whole track to begin with, the bigger questions we started out with. And I was, it felt a little risky to send it out there. I did have tenure, so I wasn't going to get fired for it, but I felt like it would be, provocative in certain ways. But it was actually really gratifying because a bunch of people wrote to me, some, similarly disaffected grad students who were like, "Oh God, this is how I feel." But also some people who are further along in the career, a bunch of people who I thought would probably take it quite poorly seem to really like it. So I think it does those worries, they're out there in the field. It's just that people are, God, I sound like, Trump. I'm saying things everyone's thinking. I don't really mean that. I just mean, I think that we have to sort of present this united front for the field. But I think a lot of us have these doubts because we came into the field because we are deep thinkers and we care about big questions. And our work doesn't allow us to do those things to the degree that you would hope it would.
I'm so glad you caught yourself there because when Trump gave that speech yesterday about Saul Kripke's damning and necessity, I was like, whoa. It's like, okay. Someone Trump does do a lot of speech acts, as it were, but not of the nature that you're describing. Um, but no, I mean, I think I I actually really second what you said about the the unified front that would maybe provide for a more expansive view of the discipline, right? Because you're right. Like I've seen this has not been my experience because I worked in the English department, but of course I know that grind. Bit of a pejorative term, but I'll be bold and use it here. I know that grind of like, okay, like here's this conjecture, here's this proof, here's this paper, right? And I've witnessed many people kind of go through that ad infinitum until they get tenure. But I think that, you know, one of the things that I was reminded of just now as you were speaking was like my very first, I think it was my intro epistemology class. I had a very kind professor. I went to his office. I was like 18 or 19. I asked a series of like stonery questions. I was like, he could have just like dryly given me, Wittgenstein's Tractatus and been like, here's how you know that the flower that you're seeing is yellow and it's also yellow for me too. We agree to refer to it as yellow. But he kind of sat in his office with me. He's a very kind guy. And this is a conversation that he himself had maybe had with a professor, and he's had students constantly asking these questions for the years. And I could tell that like for him, it of course it wasn't about just like let's get her out of my office, right? Or let's like tick this box. He was there's something I think pleasurable for him in engaging in the conversation and watching like, oh, like another student, like another young mind or whatever, grappling with this topic that like I care about.
Yeah.
and it's so abstracted for me and it's so different for me now, but it's kind of great to watch students revisit it. And I felt in those early classes like the Emily Dickinson book. I felt at the top of my head was come
Yeah.
off, like constantly getting unscrewed so delightfully, and that's why I chose to major. And I think your work really calls for a return to that approach or that feeling, at least. I
Yeah.
remember that feeling. I love
Yeah, yeah. And it's hard to know really what to do about academia. This isn't just a problem in philosophy, of course. There are like
that. Of
plenty of
course,
academia that get
yes.
distorted and deformed in various ways just by the fact that it's not just a kind of intellectual activity, but also a career and an institutional setting and so on. So there are these big problems, and you could just throw the whole thing out. I'm not like that radical. I do think there is some, significant value to the ways that philosophers go about approaching some of their problems. Like I think it's very useful, and I
Mhm.
use a lot of it in my work. I couldn't have written the twins book without drawing on a whole bunch of really interesting, like well thought out articles in academic journals. So I'm not anti-journal, but I do what I'm trying to think with this new book is think about ways that we can at least supplement existing academic writing with other genres too that will allow us to use more of ourselves. Maybe use humor, storytelling, more feeling. We can use emotion in our work and not be censored for it. So I think the philosophical personal essay is a really good form for that. You can still do some arguing, you can still be talking about recognizably philosophical, theoretical, deep questions, but you can do it in a different way that allows you to draw on more of your resources and connect to those early motivations that a lot of us had for getting into the field. So at the moment, I'm thinking of it as a kind of two-pronged solution when we do keep doing the original stuff, but also do this other thing. But I do kind of think sometimes some of the critiques that I'm making in this new book do go deeper than that and should make us think about even, in our normal academic work, that we should be approaching things differently than we do. So I'm not quite sure if it's a totally stable solution over the long term, but in the meantime, anyway, I've definitely felt much, much better about being in the field and much closer to my original motivations in philosophy since I've let myself do this other genre on the side. Maybe it's not the side now. It's kind of the whole thing.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that new book. I got to be an early reader of this book. Of course, surprise, surprise, I love this book. I think that I agree with you. It's less a case of let's scrap the current methodology altogether, and take this new approach, but it's more like let's expand. I think you want the field to be a bit more creatively capacious than it is currently. And I consider the work you've done in philosophy the first person to be a great public service to that effect. You're basically in the book encouraging philosophers to write personal essays, or at the very least, locate whatever highly idiosyncratic loose sally of the mind. I always love that term for the essay. Got the philosopher interested in their discipline in the first place. It's such a great, bless you for doing this. It's really great, and I really would love for you to maybe preview this book a bit and talk more about what's covered there and yeah, your aims in writing it.
Yeah, so it's a shortish book. It's a bit meta. It's a collection of philosophical personal essays about writing philosophical personal essays. So the main part of it is these four essays. One's on emotion, one's on style, literary style, I guess. One's on narrative, one's on humor. So I think those four things are a large part of the problem they're missing, right, in standard academic writing. And those four elements also are what makes writing personal, in the personal essay sense. So if you want to make philosophy feel more connected to the average person's, everyday concerns and to feel more authentically part of the author's, sensibility, then bringing emotion and style and narrative humor back into the writing is a good way to do it. So it's called Philosophy in the First Person, and it's encouraging people to try and think of ways that they could bring those aspects back in. But it's hard to do because there's a reason that they've been sidelined in philosophy, in academia, but I think especially in philosophy. And so if you think about emotion, there's this long-standing opposition between emotion and reason. Philosophers are on the reason side, and it's also very gendered, of course. Philosophy is a super, male-coded field, and men are the reasoners. So there's a whole history to that too. So it's hard when you've been trained. You've maybe got a temperament that caused you to lean in the reason over emotion direction to begin with, and then you go through this professional training where rationality and reason are highlighted at the expense of emotion. It's pretty difficult to get back to more of a feeling orientation. So the book
Yeah.
talks about why that opposition is there and why it's actually helpful for philosophy to integrate emotion more, and then give some advice about how to do it. And the same goes for the other three too. Philosophy is not, I think, has actually some deep connections with humor, if you really think about it. But the average contemporary article is not funny at all, and it's not a narrative genre. There may be these little mini stories, little thought experiments, but you don't get extended narrative. And the style is just like mind numbing most of the time. It's very conventional. There's no room for the author's idiosyncratic stylistic features. It's yeah, it has this like super standard form that you're not supposed to mess with. So the book is sort of highlighting why it is that those four things are missing from philosophy and how we might work our way back into them, using my own, troubled experience with those things in the field and the rest of my life, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love that you write a book making a case for the form of the philosophical personal essay via the philosophical personal essay. And of course, this is the form through which I found you. And I am also a huge fan of writing a philosophical personal essay. It's so I think it's like such a actually to go back to the twin paradigm here, and sorry that I'm doing a binary thing, but it's such a lovely balance, I think, of the uh the rational, right, and the emotional, right? Because you do have in every piece of writing of yours I've read, you do have that sort of steady, rigorous inquiry happening. And you are also incorporating real character and gregariousness and of course humor, right? And I think that it just makes for a more pleasant read. Like if I'm trying to think back on the articles I read as an undergrad, and I remember like Twin Earth. I
Right.
remember like I remember what is it, the what is it to be a bat?
Right.
The yeah, like these kind of like really great thought experiments, because they're memorable, and they're illustrating really valuable, useful concepts. But if I really were to distill those essays down to what made them most memorable, it would be, well, this works as a metaphor really well for me. And yeah, I think embracing the kind of more lyrical and creative side of things is what is actually going to make the investigation more memorable. Um,
Right, it's true. The
yeah,
point is, yeah, it's more memorable, and also it can, yeah, you can really, I think each of these elements isn't just a sort of useful decoration that helps the pill go down, though it might also be that, right? It can be doing
sure.
substantive work too. So yeah,
Yes.
the task of the book is or the project of the book is to show how these things are actually deeply philosophically significant and useful. Not just, people love public philosophy and they talk about how it's important for people to find it engaging and accessible. I'm totally on board with that. But I think
Yeah.
sometimes that undersells what these less traditional elements can do, because they can do real philosophical work too. And yeah, it just seems like it seems unfortunate to not draw on resources that we have, if we have them. But I think the philosophical personal essay rather is a particularly good way to bring these things back in, because trying to write a short story or like a novel as a philosopher, as standard analytic philosopher is going to be a big reach for most of us, right? You really have to go so far from what you used to. And the essay, at least, even if it doesn't look like an academic article, it does have like a strong argumentative through line a lot of the time. The structure is going to be, less well defined, a bit more oblique and digressive, and so on, and experimental. But you have a sustained, pursuit of a question that's troubling the essayist, and that's what it is to be a philosopher, is to be troubled by a question. So there are certain features built into the essay that I think are really well attuned to philosophers. We just have to allow ourselves to do that, and in a more flexible and novel way. So I think it's a nice on ramp. Maybe once people start writing philosophical personal essays, they might end up doing other kinds of creative writing too. But this is sort of the gateway drug, I think, to being a literary writer if you have that inclination.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And you're making me think of what novelists or short story writers could credibly teach a philosophy class, like an analytic philosophy class. I mean, I thought of Ted Chiang.
Yeah, okay.
Ted, right? Like I could totally see the story of your life being used in a philosophy of language class.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and you have actually, I'm thinking I taught a class that it really endeavored to do just what you're describing, right? Where it's like let's make the jump from a philosophical concept to a piece of fiction. Like, can we do it? Granted, of course, the students were fiction students, so it was far easier, I think, for them to start thinking
You're
that
going
way
in
than
the
if
other
they,
direction. Yeah.
yeah, instead of like, okay, come from philosophy. But we read an article on utilitarianism, and we read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas.
Yeah.
Um, and it was just really, I think it was really, really great to see the concept like side to side with a story illustrating the concept.
Yeah.
And Le Guin's story is just so vivid, and so it was really kind of, you know, it was really a cool class to teach. And when I hear you describing basically like the way that the philosophical personal essay could function as a sort of gateway drug, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. And in fact, there are novelists who I think would benefit from these like more systematic lines of inquiry that one learns with an analytic background.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I used to this. I mean, it goes back to my binarizing habit, maybe as a twin, but I spent a lot of time. This is my cat, Juno.
I do know.
I
Cute.
spent a lot of time in my 30s when I started having this crisis about philosophy, thinking, oh, am I a philosopher or a writer? More literary writer. I've got to choose between
Yeah,
these two things. Is it philosophy versus literature? Which side am I on? And I didn't, what made it so difficult is I didn't feel that I was on either side. I didn't feel fully at home in philosophy because I had these literary inclinations. But I would go to, writer camp. I'd hang out with a bunch of creative writers, and, certain things that they did, it really irritated me. Like sometimes I would just really want to pursue the question, right? And I would want to
right.
think of an actual answer to it. And there was this kind of, real resistance among some of that crowd to doing like extended idea-driven writing, because it felt that it was somehow, unliterary. So I felt like I was stuck between these two camps. So it's like, I guess it's sort of this current project is trying out the synthesis where you do both at the same time. It's not about it of choosing. You don't have to identify with one side. There are common preoccupations, different ways of getting to them. So just not being so obsessed with seeing those as contrary ways to approach the world, but companion ones, with their own quirks for sure. But yeah, I think if you can really do it, if you can make the literary stuff and the philosophical idea stuff, work well together, it's just like it's a magic thing. It's my favorite thing to read. So
It
you'll
is.
check it
Yeah,
out.
I mean, if you can, as the kids say these days, if you can keep it Hegelian, if you can
Exactly.
keep this going, um, which actually, by the way, I think you get into in your writings on like the philosophy of memoir, another wonderful book here,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Artful Truths. Yeah, I have many a memoirist friend who has read and adored this book. Um, and just more broadly, I think writers writing in all genres would really, really do well to read this. But you start to talk about, right, that like by follow it, kind of like following a question, pursuing a question, you start to talk about that really beautiful holy union of art and inquiry, aesthetics and philosophy. And it got me thinking, you have these some kind of funny scenes in your multi-part essay where like you go to one of these writer camps and you raise a question and the other writer is like regard you as oracular because you've like raised a question or like you put something cogently. And I was like, well, this shouldn't have to be the case. But wait, come on, guys. Like I mean, yes, you're an oracle. We agree that you're an oracle. But like, no, it shouldn't be the case, right? That this is somehow unlimited, right? That this we can be systematic. Um, and in our discussions of like what is fiction and what is memoir. And so I was thinking about this in preparation for our interview, and I'm working on what one might describe as like an autobiographical novel, right? Where it's somewhere between autofiction and like pure fiction, where but there's so much in there that is based on true events. Um, and you are when you're writing about memoir and artful truths, you're exploring the ethics of memoir and what we owe as writers to the memoir subjects. You're also exploring sort of the whether there is a credible bright line between fiction and nonfiction, right? Or the not a novel and a memoir. And it's I mean, certainly like illuminated a lot of what I keep turning around in my head as I'm working on this project of mine. And I'm wondering if you could kind of spell that out a bit more, because this is a podcast video situation that's listened to by a lot of fiction writers.
Yeah,
You might want to
right.
know.
So one of the questions I get into in that book, in Artful Truths, I think it's in the first chapter, is about whether it really makes sense to see memoir as a distinct genre from fiction, right? And one of the reasons you might be led to that question is the one we talked about earlier, about whether or not that this question whether the self is unified and stable enough, right? If you think that the self is a fiction, really, it's just a kind of made up element. You might think that the character in a memoir, the narrator protagonist, is just as much a kind of fictional creation as the protagonist in a novel, right? You might also think another reason to worry about memoir as a sort of fact-based or truth-based nonfiction account is that we don't have very good, we have reason to think that we're self-deceiving a lot when we tell stories about our lives, when we narrate our own lives. And also, even if we're not self-deceiving, that we just lack lots of knowledge that we have to sort of like pad out the memoir with. So there are these epistemic worries, there are metaphysical worries. There's also the fact that memoirs often have a narrative component, and narrative can be seen as a kind of construction that distorts the truth, right? Because the world isn't really story shaped, right? So all these reasons to think that memoirs are actually a lot less I don't know, accurate or fact-based than we might think that they are, even if the author is trying very sincerely to like tell a true story, right? So some people want to try and collapse the boundary between fiction and nonfiction. I don't. I think feel like I don't think we need to go that far. I think that we can accept that the self is a relatively unstable thing, and that we don't know as much as we would like to know about it, and still write an account, of our own lives that is distinct from fiction. I think there is a real boundary there. Go into it a lot in the book, so I'm not going to sound super persuasive right now, but I think there are reasons or we're justified in drawing that boundary. But another sort of take on this is to say, well, why do we even need that boundary really? Why can't we just aim to write good books, right? Does it matter whether it's, a memoir or nonfiction or fiction? Why don't we just like write interesting, cool stuff that, is is compelling and fun to read and has aesthetic value, etc., is insightful. I don't really like that either. I think it is helpful to have something of a division between these genres. And part of that is just that it's if you know with what you're reading, if you can sort of class what you're reading as, say, autofiction or memoir or fiction, if you've got a certain kind of framework for approaching the text, I think it helps you to read it better, to draw out various kinds of value in it that you might not otherwise be able to locate. So if you know that that a book is fiction, then you're more likely to be looking at, I don't know, sort of symbolic resonances in the text. So you're more likely to think, oh, this particular event, is it doing something um, that's, I don't know, that has a certain sort of deeper layer to it? Is it connecting to some kind of motif? You're going to be thinking more about what the underlying significance might be. If it's a nonfiction account, you're less likely to be doing that to the same degree, right? You're going to be tending more as a reader to the claims being made. You might be thinking about whether they're true or not. So it sort of directs your reading in different ways that I think can be helpful. So I think there are aesthetic reasons, just from the point of view of the reading experience, to think that it's useful to have some guidance in genre terms. But then there's like the moral reasons, that you might think that it's really important to have a genre or a set of genres under the nonfiction umbrella that make a commitment to making true claims about the world, and another set of genres under the fiction umbrella that don't so much. If you want to make sure that you're protecting people that you write about, like not making claims about them that might be problematic for them. So I think there are moral and aesthetic reasons to keep those divisions there. But that's not to say that you need to, I don't know, be super rigid about it. They're going to be interesting hybrid versions of those things. I don't know. I've been talking a lot. There's a lot of things to say about that. But why do you think it is that you, for instance, have chosen to do something that's an autobiographical novel or on the border of autofiction as opposed to just writing what would be seen as a more standard novel?
I mean, it's actually quite, I think it's my reasons, I think are pretty consonant with your interest in this topic. Simpliciter. Um, because you're asking questions, right, about the utility of the genre distinction. You're asking questions about the utility of writing that uh, endeavors to make true claims about the world versus writing that does not. And the point is very much not doing that, but like it, still is aiming at some kind of truth, right? And so I think that for me, um, this book concerns a very classic, what could pretty uncontroversially be construed as very classic traumatic experience. And
Yeah.
it was, um, it's the kind of thing that needs your, right? It's a bit sensational, this thing that happened. And it's something that it could really, really easily just become the stuff of men, right? And in fact, millennial gal that I am, I like posted, essays and this, that, and the other, right, on this very Substack concerning some of this stuff. But it's I had a really, really valuable conversation, right, with my wife about this a few months ago because I knew that I wanted to write this book, right, and I knew that this insane experience in my life was like sitting like a kind of like a lump in my throat, and I had to get it out. I knew I didn't want it to be memoir. And yet I was writing this book that was like, it was just this kind of bloated, like my agent described it as being about like 18 things. And it really needs to be about like one or two things, and it was this a trauma narrative, kind of a unilateral trauma narrative, like seen through the eyes of someone like me, or if not me, then very similar. And it was important that this narrator not be like a perfect victim. So then I was going off on all these spirals and like, oh, don't worry, like this character's done bad stuff too. And what it ended up being, Helena, was like not even an art object. It ended up
Yeah,
being, yeah, like an endless trauma dump.
yeah,
And
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, like it wasn't just about like a question of saleability. It was just like, it was like people were reading it, I would have my whatever reading group of friends. So, oh, yay, because it was dramatic, right? But it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. And I didn't realize that it could um, do something more than be a narration of this happened and then this happened. This like bad story picaresque, right? Like all these bad stuff happens to the character. until I split the points of view. So it's actually the antagonist and the victim. And then in, when I did that, it became a story not just about this character's victimhood, right? And this, like, oh, whatever, the scary person on their side, but it became a story that kind of troubled of the notions of antagonism and victimhood altogether.
Yeah.
And it's just so much more interesting. And then it was at that point then I was able to like get distance from it, and I wasn't just narrating the hard time. And so I think that's kind of why this is so interesting to me, right? Because it's like I wanted to write this, right? I'm given to write about things that happen to me, for better or worse. And I wanted to get some kind of an aerial view, right? And use this in some way that would like be helpful or valuable. But I couldn't do that until I had a long, hard think about like what's fiction, what's nonfiction. And in fact, had this conversation with my wife, who was like, "You can take a bolder approach."
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool to hear you talking about it because I feel like in some ways I've gone in the other direction. I'd like to sort of move back to where I was. But when I stopped writing philosophy and started doing creative writing, I started doing fiction. So I tried to
Hmm.
write. In my case, I was just not very good at it. But I felt like it just kept being about me. I'm trying to write something fictional and it becomes a memoir. And it sounds like in your case, you're writing a memoir and it's moved more in the fictional direction. So I think sometimes it is just about the nature of the material and the kind of constraints that you're under. It sounds like in your case. But it might also be a kind of, I don't know, temperamental or I don't know, sort of orientation based thing where it's like your way of thinking about really important stuff, including stuff that happened to you, um, is like often going to be fiction. That might be you. Obviously, you also write personal essays. I'm not trying to put you in the fiction writer category, but it's like it makes sense to me because you're such a great novelist that you would feel that there were resources, associated with fiction that you could draw on here to make this project richer. And it would seem a shame not to use them. In my
Right.
case, more like I don't have these resources when I'm trying to write fiction, and I feel like I could do it, the other way more effectively. So, yeah.
Well, and I think it touches too back on the philosophy of the first person, right? Where it's like you're the tool best suited to you for your sort of like purposes or investigation purposes is the like lens of the first person. So like you're bringing in that emotion and experience and embodiment, like whatever you want to call it, to um this inquiry, right? This line of inquiry that has like really systematically and carefully, with a loop and a scalpel, like removed it.
Right.
And I think that's really, yeah, that makes sense, and I think it's very cool. Helena, thank you so much for
Yeah.
coming on the old podcast. What a delight.
Talk with you. I'm so glad that you wrote to me, whatever it was 3 years ago in the middle of the night, maybe tripping on
Uh,
something, and we began this.
no, well, I'm probably just tripping on lack of sleep, but but yes, I'm so glad I did too. And everyone watching, please grab both these books. You should be able to get them from bookshop.org. If not in bound form, then there's definitely ebooks to be gotten from my bookshop. When you support the Cosmic Cheeto Bookshop, you of course supporting authors like Helena, myself, who makes a small commission, and Bookshop, which does its very best to actually sell books by authors to people who want to read them as opposed to whatever is going on with Amazon. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading, or what rather, I've read it, but seeing Philosophy in the First Person out in the world. I'm gonna stop this little recording now, but man, thank you for a great talk.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely.